The wind on the Nebraska plains was a bitter companion, a constant whisper of dust and desolation. For Sarah, the preacher's daughter, it was the only sound she'd known for days, save for the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the low groan of her weary father. Reverend Elijah Wells was a man of the cloth, but the journey west had stripped him of more than just his pastoral dignity. The harsh sun had baked his skin to a leathery brown, and his once strong hands now trembled as he gripped the reins. They were headed to a new settlement, a fledgling town named Haven's End, a name that felt more like a cruel joke than a promise. Her father had heard tales of opportunity, of a community ripe for a spiritual leader. Sarah, however, saw only the vast, unforgiving expanse, a land that seemed to swallow hope whole. Her mother had passed away a year ago, and the grief, heavy as a millstone, had been their only passenger. The wagon, their sole possession, was little more than a box on wheels. Inside, amongst their meager belongings, was the Bible, a well-worn book of Proverbs, and a faded photograph of her mother smiling gently. Sarah traced the lines on her mother's face with a finger, a pang of loneliness twisting in her gut. She missed the soft-spoken woman who had taught her to read the scriptures and find comfort in their words. Now, the scriptures felt as empty as the landscape around them. The sun was a searing orb in the sky, a relentless force that drained the very life from the land. Elijah slumped forward, his breathing shallow. "Sarah," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "The water. We're almost out." Sarah's heart sank. She'd been rationing their last canteen for 2 days, a grim game of survival. "I know, Father," she said, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "We'll find a stream. We must be close to the river." But they weren't. The landscape stretched on, a monochrome tapestry of brown and grey. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and desperation. The wagon hit a deep rut, and with a sickening crack one of the wheels splintered. The wagon lurched to a halt, the sudden silence deafening. Sarah jumped down, her boots kicking up a cloud of dust. The wheel was beyond repair, the spokes shattered. "No," she whispered, the single word a prayer and a curse. Elijah, roused by the jolt, stared at the broken wheel, his eyes wide with a fear that mirrored her own. "God help us," he murmured, his hands clasped together in a futile plea. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Sarah. They were miles from anywhere, stranded in the middle of nowhere with a dying man and no water. She looked up at the vast, indifferent sky, her faith a distant, flickering candle. "God isn't here," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. Just then, a silhouette appeared on the horizon, a figure on horseback, impossibly large against the setting sun. Sarah's stomach clenched. A mountain man, a giant cowboy, as her father called them, a lawless shadow of the West. He was a force of nature, a living, breathing part of the wilderness, and she feared him more than she feared the endless prairie. He rode closer, his horse a powerful beast of muscle and sinew. The man was a colossus, broad-shouldered and rugged, with a beard that seemed to hold the secrets of the land. He stopped a few yards away, his gaze sweeping from the broken wagon to their terrified faces. "Trouble," his voice boomed, a low rumble that echoed in the silence. Sarah shook her head quickly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. "No, we're fine. Just a slight delay." She pulled her father closer, a protective shield of a daughter. She didn't want his help. She feared he would follow. She feared what he represented. But as she looked at her father's ashen face, she knew her fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. The choice was a brutal one: rely on a man she didn't trust, or watch her father fade away in the dust. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and fiery crimson. The long night was coming, and with it, a decision she would have to live with. If you're enjoying this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this thrilling adventure. The mountain man dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his massive frame. He moved with the quiet confidence of a predator, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, observing everything. "Seems more than a delay," he said, his gaze fixed on the shattered wheel. "You're a long way from anywhere with a broken wagon and no water." He carried a rifle slung over his back, its barrel glinting in the fading light, and a worn leather satchel at his hip. His presence filled the air, a potent mix of wood smoke, leather, and something wilder. Sarah's fear was a tangible thing, a cold knot in her stomach. "We have supplies," she lied, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll manage." The man simply smiled, a slow, weary expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Girl, I've been on these plains for a lifetime. You'll not last the night without water. Your father looks ready to meet his maker." The brutal honesty stung, but it was the truth. Elijah was barely conscious, his lips cracked and his breathing shallow. Sarah knelt beside him, placing a hand on his feverish forehead. The man watched her, his expression unreadable. "My name is Silas," he said, breaking the tense silence. "I'm heading north, but I can't leave a man to die on the trail." He walked over to the wagon, his massive hands inspecting the damage. "This wheel is gone. You'll need to leave the wagon." Sarah's heart seized. Leave the wagon. It held everything they had left of their old life. "We can't," she said, her voice rising in panic. "The Bible, my mother's things." "You'll get a new Bible," Silas said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "And a new home. You can't carry everything. We'll take what's essential. The rest is just dead weight." The words felt like a sacrilege, a betrayal of everything they had. But as she looked at her father's desperate face, she knew Silas was right. She began to quickly fill a saddlebag with a few clothes, the Bible, and her mother's photograph. Silas, in the meantime, had found a spare canteen on his saddle and offered it to Elijah. The preacher drank greedily, the water seeming to bring a flicker of life back to his eyes. "We have to move," Silas said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "There are wolves out here at night, and other things." The unspoken threat hung in the air. Sarah and Elijah were forced to ride on Silas's horse. Elijah slumped forward, held in place by Silas's strong arm. The horse was a powerful animal, its stride eating up the distance. Sarah, perched awkwardly behind Silas, tried to ignore his imposing presence, the warmth of his body, the scent of wood smoke and leather. Every bump, every sway of the horse brought her closer to him, a terrifying intimacy she fought against. She kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, the moon a silver sliver in the vast, star-dusted sky. She was grateful, yes, but her fear hadn't vanished. The mountain man had saved them, but to where was he leading them? And what would he want in return? The journey through the night was a silent blur of shadows and the rhythmic hoofbeats of the horse. Sarah, exhausted and terrified, clung to Silas, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and gratitude. She noticed how he handled his rifle, not with aggression, but with a practiced ease, as if it were an extension of his own arm. He was a man of the wilderness, and she, a city girl, was a stranger in his world. As dawn broke, a faint smudge of smoke appeared on the horizon, a sign of civilization. It was Haven's End. The town was a collection of rough-hewn shacks and a single, sturdier building that served as the saloon. A few people were already stirring, their movements slow and deliberate. Silas rode straight to a small, isolated cabin on the edge of town, dismounting with Elijah still in his arms. The preacher was weak but conscious, his face a ghostly white. Silas carried him inside, laying him gently on a cot. The cabin was Spartan but clean, with a roaring fire in the hearth. "I have some herbs," Silas said, his voice softer now. "They'll help with the fever." He set to work, crushing dried leaves and roots, his hands moving with surprising delicacy. Sarah watched him, her skepticism battling her gratitude. He was not the brute she had imagined. News of the preacher's arrival spread quickly. Soon, a few townsfolk gathered outside, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. A woman named Martha, her face etched with hard living but her eyes kind, came in with a bowl of warm stew. "Welcome to Haven's End, Reverend," she said, her voice gentle. "We've been praying for a man of God." Elijah, propped up on pillows, managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Ma'am," he whispered. "Your kindness is a blessing." Sarah, meanwhile, stood in the corner, a silent guardian. She was still on edge, her gaze flitting between the townsfolk and Silas. He had saved them, but he was still a stranger, a man of the wild. He wasn't a part of this town, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was a danger, a threat to her father's new life. Silas, finished with his work, stepped outside, leaving Sarah alone with her father and the townsfolk. "I'll be back," he said to Sarah, his voice low. "Don't go getting any ideas about running off, not yet." The words were a warning, a promise, and a source of fresh dread for Sarah. She looked at her father, now asleep and then at the open door. Silas was gone, but his presence lingered, a shadow in the corner of her mind. He had saved them, but he had also brought them here, to a place where he was a known quantity. What did he want? And when would he come back to claim his debt? Days turned into a week, and then 2. Reverend Elijah Wells slowly regained his strength, his spirit rekindled by the kindness of the townsfolk. Haven's End, it turned out, was a town of good people, a community forged by the hardships of the frontier. They brought them food, helped repair their wagon, and listened eagerly to Elijah's sermons. Sarah found herself slowly thawing, the town's warmth a stark contrast to the coldness of the prairie. Silas, the mountain man, was a phantom. He would appear suddenly, his presence a quiet thunder, and then vanish just as quickly. He never stayed long, never spoke more than a few words, and always watched from the shadows. Sarah's fear hadn't abated, it had simply changed form. It was no longer the fear of immediate danger, but a simmering dread of what he might do next. She saw him in the distance, his towering figure a landmark on the plains, and felt a constant anxiety. One afternoon, she found him mending a fence on the outskirts of town, his massive hands working with a craftsman's precision. "Why are you still here?" she blurted out, unable to hold her tongue any longer. Silas paused, his gaze fixed on the distance. "I made a promise," he said, his voice as rough as sandpaper. "A promise to myself. I brought you here. I'll make sure you're safe." "Safe from what?" she challenged. "From who? From you?" He finally turned to face her, his eyes serious. "There are things out here you don't understand, girl. This town, it has a protector, but the protection is not free." His words sent a shiver down her spine. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "Your father's new church," he said, gesturing towards the small, fledgling building the townsfolk were constructing. "It's built on land that belongs to a man named Jedediah Stone. He's a powerful man. He doesn't take kindly to new arrivals, especially those who come with a cross and a Bible." Sarah's blood ran cold. "And you know him?" "I know everyone out here," Silas said simply. "Stone's men. They're the other things I was talking about. He uses this town for his own ends. He's the wolf, and these people, they're the sheep." The truth was a bitter pill to swallow. Silas hadn't just saved them. He had brought them into a larger, more dangerous conflict. "Why did you help us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Silas looked away, his jaw tight. "I have my reasons," he said, his voice a low growl. "Your father's a good man. He's what this town needs, and I'm not going to let Stone tear it down." He turned back to his work, the conversation over. Sarah, however, was left with a horrifying realization. Her father's new life, the one she had prayed for, was built on a lie. They were not safe, and Silas, the man she feared, was their only hope. He was a protector, a shadow in the wilderness, but he was also a part of the very danger she had tried to escape. The preacher's daughter was now caught between a man of God and a man of the wild, and she had no idea which one would save them or which one would destroy them. This is the end of the 4th chapter. Please subscribe to our channel for the rest of this compelling story. Sarah's newfound knowledge was a heavy burden. She couldn't tell her father. His faith was his armor, and she feared the truth would shatter it. He was so happy, so invigorated by the town's need for his sermons, that she couldn't bear to be the one to extinguish his light. He saw Haven's End as a testament to God's will, a barren land that had blossomed into a community of believers. He was blind to the shadows, to the watchful presence of Silas, to the unspoken threat of Jedediah Stone. One evening, as her father was preparing a sermon, Sarah sat with him, trying to find a way to broach the subject. "Father," she began, her voice soft, "are you sure this is a safe place? There are stories." Elijah looked up from his Bible, his eyes clear and full of conviction. "Daughter, where God calls us, there is no danger we cannot face. The people here are good, and they need a shepherd. This is where we belong." His unwavering faith was both a comfort and a frustration. Sarah wanted to believe him, but her conversations with Silas had opened her eyes to a darker reality. The town's peace was a fragile illusion, maintained by a delicate balance of fear and protection, and Silas, the man she feared, was the fulcrum of that balance. She decided to confront Silas again, this time with a more direct question. She found him at a small stream, cleaning a fresh catch of fish. "What is your relationship with Jedediah Stone?" she asked, her voice firm. Silas didn't look up. "He's a man of greed. I'm a man of the mountains. We don't mix." "But he's a danger to this town," she pressed. "Why haven't you stopped him?" "Stopping him is a different kind of trouble," Silas said, finally meeting her gaze. "Stone has men. He's got influence. I can't just ride in and shoot him. That would bring a storm down on this place that would wipe it off the map. So you just let him threaten everyone?" "No," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "I keep him at bay. He knows I'm here. He knows I'm watching. He respects my word, because he knows I'm a man who keeps his promises." The conversation was a revelation. Silas wasn't just a mountain man. He was a silent guardian, a man who had chosen to stand between a town and its wolves. His presence was the fence that kept the danger out, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that he was a wolf himself, simply one who had chosen to protect the flock. She was still terrified of him, but a new emotion was beginning to take root, a reluctant respect. He was a man of action, not of words, and his quiet strength was a stark contrast to her father's hopeful sermons. The preacher's daughter had always believed in a righteous God. Now she was beginning to understand that the world also needed men like Silas, men who lived in the gray, men who protected the innocent not with faith, but with a rifle and a promise. The fragile peace of Haven's End was shattered with the arrival of Jedediah Stone. He rode into town with a small band of armed men, their presence a dark cloud on the bright sunny day. The townsfolk, who had been laughing and chatting just moments before, fell silent, their faces a mask of fear. Stone was a man built of money and malice. He was not as imposing as Silas, but his power was a different kind of force, one that radiated from his cold, dead eyes. He dismounted in front of the makeshift church, his gaze sweeping over the town with a proprietary air. He spotted Sarah first, his eyes lingering on her with a predatory interest that made her skin crawl. "So," he said, his voice an oily, smooth drawl. "This is the preacher's daughter. Heard you and your father were in need of a new home. Too bad you didn't come to me. I've got plenty of land for a pretty thing like you." Elijah, his face pale, stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. "My daughter and I are under God's protection, Mr. Stone," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Stone laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "God's protection? Boy, you're on my land now, and on my land my word is the law." He gestured towards the church. "This little prayer house, it's built on my property, and I'm going to need a hefty fee for the rent, say $100 a month, or maybe a new wife." The implication was clear. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The townsfolk shuffled their feet, their eyes on the ground, unable to meet Stone's gaze. Elijah, however, stood firm. "We don't have that kind of money," he said, his voice gaining strength. "And my daughter is not a commodity." Stone's smile vanished. "Then you have a choice, preacher. Pay me or get out. You have 1 week." With a final, chilling look at Sarah, he turned and rode away, his men following close behind. The silence that followed was heavy with despair. The town's hope, so carefully built, felt like it was about to crumble. The townsfolk looked at Elijah, their faith in him now mixed with fear. He had promised them God's protection, but God, it seemed, was a distant force in the face of Jedediah Stone. Sarah's mind, however, was not on God, it was on Silas. The mountain man had told her this would happen. He was the one who could stop Stone. But where was he? Was he watching from the shadows, as he always did? She had refused his help before, but now, with her father's life and her own future at stake, she knew she had to find him. He was their only hope, the one man who could stand up to Jedediah Stone. The preacher's daughter, once afraid of the mountain man, was now seeking him out, a desperate plea on her lips. Sarah found Silas a day later, high on a ridge overlooking the town, his gaze fixed on Jedediah Stone's sprawling ranch in the distance. He was sitting with his back to a rock, cleaning his rifle, the very picture of a man at peace with his world. But she knew better. She knew the storm was coming, and that he was the only one who could weather it. She climbed the rocky path, her breath catching in her throat. "Jedediah Stone was in town," she said, her voice breathless. "He wants to take the church, and he threatened my father." Silas didn't look at her, his hands meticulously oiling the rifle barrel. "I know," he said simply. "I was watching." The admission infuriated her. "And you did nothing?" "I was waiting," he said, finally turning to face her. "He's a snake, girl. You don't fight a snake in the open, you wait for it to coil." "My father has 1 week," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "We can't pay him, and he's going to hurt someone." Silas's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, softened slightly. "I know." He gestured to the vast landscape below. "Stone's been a thorn in my side for years. He uses this land, abuses the people on it. I've been waiting for a reason to finally put an end to it. And my father's church is that reason? A preacher's a new kind of light out here," he said, his voice low and serious. "The light draws the bugs. Stone's a bug, and I don't like bugs on my land." The words, though strange, were a lifeline. "So you'll help us?" she asked, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "It's not just your problem anymore," he said, standing up, his imposing height casting a shadow over her. "It's the town's problem, and it's mine." He outlined his plan, a daring and dangerous scheme to lure Stone and his men into a trap. Sarah listened, her fear slowly replaced by a grim determination. She realized that Silas wasn't just a brute. He was a tactician, a man who understood the landscape and the people on it better than anyone. He was a force of nature, and now he was on their side. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady. Silas looked at her, a hint of a smile on his lips. "You go back to town, you keep your father safe, and you tell him to keep preaching. We're going to give Stone a reason to believe in God after all." Sarah nodded, a new kind of courage flowing through her veins. She was no longer just the preacher's daughter, she was an ally, a part of a larger conflict. She was walking a path she never imagined, a path that led her away from the safety of her faith and into the dangerous world of a mountain man. She had feared the giant cowboy would follow, but now she was following him, her heart filled with a mixture of terror and fierce hope. This is the end of the 7th chapter. Please subscribe to our channel for the rest of this compelling story. The week passed in a haze of anxiety and preparation. Sarah kept the details of Silas's plan a secret from her father, who, despite his worry, continued to preach with a newfound passion. He spoke of God's grace in the face of adversity, of a community's strength, and of the power of faith. The townsfolk, however, were not so optimistic. They knew Jedediah Stone was a man of his word, and they were preparing for the worst. On the 7th day, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Stone and his men returned. But this time, they were not here to threaten, they were here to take. "Time's up, preacher," Stone sneered, his gaze fixed on Sarah. "The church is mine, and the girl, she's coming with me." Elijah, his face pale but his eyes burning with righteous fury, stepped forward. "She is not yours to take," he said, his voice trembling but firm, "and this church belongs to God." Stone laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "God's not here, preacher, but my men are." He gestured to his armed thugs, who began to advance on the small, terrified crowd. Suddenly, a shot rang out, echoing through the canyon walls. A man fell, clutching his arm, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. Stone's men, caught off guard, spun around, their rifles raised. Silas emerged from the shadows of the canyon, his rifle held steady. He was not a man anymore. He was a vengeful spirit of the land, a silent, powerful force. "Jedediah," he boomed, his voice a low thunder, "your game is over." Stone's face twisted in fury. "You fool! You think you can stop me?" "I've been watching you for a long time, Jedediah," Silas said, his voice as cold as a winter wind. "You've been a blight on this land. You've taken from the people, abused your power, and I'm here to collect the debt." A gunfight erupted, a chaotic symphony of lead and fire. Silas, however, was a marksman of a different caliber. He moved with a speed and precision that defied his size, his shots finding their mark with deadly accuracy. Sarah, huddled with her father, watched in terrified awe. The man she had feared, the giant cowboy, was a protector, a force of justice in a lawless land. Stone, realizing he was outmatched, tried to escape, but Silas was too fast. He cornered him in the center of the street, his rifle pointed at Stone's chest. "It's over, Jedediah," Silas said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your reign of terror ends now." The standoff was broken by a single, final shot. Stone, his face a mixture of shock and terror, crumpled to the ground. The rest of his men, seeing their leader fall, dropped their weapons and fled. The silence that followed was a relief, a heavy, welcome peace that settled over the town. The townsfolk, who had cowered in fear just moments before, now emerged from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of relief and awe. They looked at Silas, the mountain man, not with fear, but with a newfound respect. He had saved them. He had fulfilled the promise of Haven's End, not with words of God, but with a rifle and a promise. Elijah, his face still pale from the ordeal, walked over to Silas. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. You saved us." Silas simply nodded, his gaze sweeping over the relieved faces of the townsfolk. "This land, preacher," he said, his voice quiet. "It needed a man of God, and it needed a man of the wild. You can't have one without the other." Sarah, her heart still pounding, walked up to him. She looked into his stormy eyes, her fear finally replaced by a deep sense of admiration and gratitude. "Why?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper. "Why did you do this for us?" Silas looked away, his gaze fixed on the distance. "I was a boy once," he said, his voice rough with memory. "My father was a preacher. He was a good man. He believed in God, in people, but he was killed by a man like Jedediah Stone. I swore on his grave that I would never let that happen again." The revelation was a stunning one. Silas wasn't just a lawless mountain man. He was a man with a past, a man with a broken heart, a man who was fighting his own ghosts. He had not just saved them, he had avenged his father. The townsfolk began to surround him, offering him food, water, and thanks. Silas, however, was a man of the mountains, not of towns. He shook his head, a small, weary smile on his face. "I have my own trail to follow," he said. He mounted his horse, the powerful beast a silent extension of his will. As he began to ride away, Sarah ran after him. "Silas, wait!" she cried. He stopped, turning to face her. "Where will you go?" she asked, a desperate plea in her voice. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness she hadn't seen before. "Back to the mountains," he said. "The wolves are gone for now, but the wilderness is always watching." He gave her a final, lingering look, and then he turned and rode away, a solitary figure disappearing into the vast, empty plains. Sarah watched him go, a sense of loss and gratitude battling in her heart. She had come to the West fearing a giant cowboy, and she had found a protector, a man who was both a shadow and a light. The preacher's daughter was no longer afraid of the mountain man. She had found a new kind of faith, not in the word of God, but in the silent, selfless actions of a good man. Life in Haven's End changed after the departure of Jedediah Stone and the return of Silas to the mountains. The town, once a place of quiet fear, now buzzed with a newfound energy and hope. The townsfolk, united by the ordeal they had faced and the protection they had received, worked together to complete the church. It was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of their resilience, a testament to the fact that they had faced the wolves and survived. Reverend Elijah Wells, his faith renewed and strengthened, led his congregation with a fiery passion. His sermons were no longer just about God's grace. They were also about human courage, about the power of community, and about the quiet strength of those who stand in the shadows. He never spoke of Silas by name, but the townsfolk knew who he was talking about. They had all seen the mountain man, the silent protector who had saved them. Sarah, too, had changed. The girl who had once feared the wilderness and its inhabitants was now a woman of the West, her eyes clear and her spirit strong. She helped her father with his sermons, but she also spent her days learning to work the land, to understand the rhythms of the prairie. She had found a new kind of purpose, a life that was both spiritual and grounded in the earth. She would often find herself on the outskirts of town, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains where Silas had disappeared. She would think of his quiet strength, his hidden pain, and the promise he had made and kept. He was a ghost now, a legend, a shadow in the wilderness that had once protected them all. One day, as she was walking near the stream, she found something. It was a carving, a small wooden figurine of a hawk perched on a branch. It was crudely made, but with a certain kind of artistry, a careful attention to detail. She knew without a doubt that it was from Silas. It was a silent message, a final goodbye, a reminder that he was still watching. Sarah held the carving in her hand, a small, sad smile on her lips. She understood now. He was a man of the wild, and he would always be a part of the wilderness. He had saved them, and in doing so, he had given her a new home, a new life, and a new kind of faith. Haven's End was a true haven now, not because of a promise, but because a giant cowboy had risked everything to protect it. And as she looked at the carving, she realized that she wasn't just the preacher's daughter anymore. She was a daughter of the West, a part of a land that was both beautiful and brutal, a land that had given her a new kind of family, a new kind of strength, and a new kind of hope. The preacher's daughter had once refused the mountain man's help, but in the end, it was his help that had set her free. Thank you for watching this amazing story. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more great content.